The cruelest thing about losing your home is realizing the people you trusted were already planning life without you. Hank Lawson stood silently beside the weathered kitchen table as snow drifted past the farmhouse window. At 68 years old, he had survived deployments overseas, brutal winters, and years of hard work, but nothing had prepared him for the look in his nephew's eyes that evening. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even resentment. It was indifference, the kind that told a man he no longer mattered. Across the room, Tyler Lawson folded a stack of papers and slid them into a manila envelope. Beside him, his wife Karen crossed her arms and stared at Hank with the cold patience of someone waiting for an unpleasant task to end. The old farmhouse had belonged to Hank's older brother for nearly 40 years. When his brother passed away 6 weeks earlier, Hank believed he would at least be allowed to stay until spring. He had helped maintain the property, repaired fences, cleared snow, and fixed tractors without complaint. It was the only home he had left. But apparently, plans had already been made. "You need to be out by tonight," Tyler said without looking up. The words settled heavily in the room. Hank blinked once. "Tonight?" Tyler finally met his eyes. "The property is being sold. We already signed the agreement." Hank glanced around the kitchen. Every corner held memories, family dinners, holidays, quiet mornings drinking coffee before sunrise. Decades of life reduced to paperwork on a table. Karen let out a small sigh. "It's nothing personal, Hank. We just need to move forward." "Nothing personal." Hank almost laughed. Instead, he nodded slowly. His gaze drifted toward the front door, where Blue lay quietly on the worn rug. The German Shepherd lifted his head immediately. His intelligent blue-gray eyes studied the room as if he understood every word. Blue had been beside Hank for nearly 8 years. Through lonely nights, long drives, and difficult days, the dog had never left his side. Unlike people, Blue never needed explanations. He simply stayed. Hank walked slowly toward the hallway and entered the small guest room he had occupied since returning home years earlier. There wasn't much left. 2 duffel bags, a toolbox, a framed photograph of his brother. He packed quietly while Blue followed close behind, never taking his eyes off him. Outside, the Montana sky darkened as another storm approached from the mountains. Wind pushed loose snow across the fields in ghostly waves. By the time Hank carried the final bag to his old pickup truck, daylight was fading. Tyler remained on the porch, watching. No apology came. No last-minute change of heart. Only silence. Hank placed the bags in the truck bed and rested a hand on Blue's neck. The dog seemed unusually tense. His ears stood upright. His gaze remained fixed on the farmhouse. Then suddenly Blue moved. Without warning, he trotted back toward the porch steps, his nose pressed against an old wooden box sitting near the doorway. The box had belonged to Hank's brother for years. Forgotten, ignored. Blue nudged it again, then again. The dog let out a low whine, unlike anything Hank had heard before. Hank frowned and walked closer. Something about Blue's behavior felt different, important. As the first snowflakes of the storm began falling from the darkening sky, Blue grabbed the handle of the box with his teeth and pulled it away from the porch, refusing to let it go. Hank stared at the wooden box as Blue tugged it farther across the snow-covered yard. "Blue, what are you doing?" he asked. The dog ignored him and kept pulling. Behind them, the farmhouse porch light flickered on. Tyler stepped outside and frowned. "Just leave that junk, Hank. It is worthless." Hank paused. "Whose box is this?" Tyler shrugged. "No idea. Probably Dad's. Been sitting there for years." Blue stopped suddenly and planted himself beside the box. His tail remained still, his eyes locked on Hank. The old veteran knelt and brushed away a layer of dust and snow. The wood was worn smooth with age. A rusted brass latch held the lid closed. "Strange," Hank murmured. "I do not remember seeing this before." Karen appeared in the doorway. "If you are taking souvenirs, please hurry. The buyers are coming tomorrow." Hank looked at her for a moment but said nothing. He opened the latch. The lid creaked softly. Inside were a few yellowed papers, an old compass, and a faded black and white photograph. Blue immediately pushed his nose toward the picture. Hank carefully lifted it into the fading light. The image showed 3 men standing in front of a stone building, somewhere in the mountains. One of them was his grandfather. Hank recognized him instantly. The second man was unfamiliar. The third had his back turned toward the camera. His heart skipped a beat. That cannot be right. He flipped the photograph over. Written in faded blue ink were 8 words. Do not believe what they tell you. Beneath the message was another line. The stone house remembers everything. Cold wind swept across the yard. Hank read the words again. Tyler laughed from the porch. Looks like some old ghost story. But Blue did not react to Tyler's voice. Instead, the dog suddenly turned toward the distant mountains. His ears stood high, his posture stiffened. Hank followed his gaze. Beyond the fields, beyond the tree line, dark peaks stretched beneath heavy storm clouds. The same direction Blue had been watching earlier. You know something, do you? Hank said quietly. Blue let out a low whine. Not fear, not anxiety. Determination. The kind Hank had learned to trust years ago. He folded the photograph and slipped it carefully into his jacket pocket. Then he closed the box and carried it toward the truck. Tyler crossed his arms. Where are you even going? Hank opened the driver's door. I do not know yet. You cannot survive up there this time of year. Hank glanced toward the mountains again. Snow was already falling harder. Maybe not. Blue jumped into the passenger seat without hesitation. Hank smiled faintly. But I have made worse journeys. The engine started with a rough growl. As the truck rolled down the frozen driveway, the farmhouse disappeared behind swirling snow. 20 minutes later, the road narrowed as it entered the forest. Darkness settled over the pines. Blue remained unusually alert, staring through the windshield. Then, without warning, he barked sharply and thrust his nose toward an unmarked trail, branching away from the main road. Hank slowed the truck and stared into the darkness. Half hidden beneath fresh snow stood an old wooden sign he had never seen before. On it was a symbol identical to the one carved into the corner of the photograph. Hank eased the truck onto the narrow trail and immediately felt the tires crunch through deeper snow. The old sign disappeared behind them as towering pines closed in on both sides. Blue remained fixed on the windshield, alert and focused. You have been leading this trip since we left the farm, Hank said with a tired smile. I sure hope you know where we are going. Blue responded with a soft huff and kept staring ahead. The trail twisted through the forest for nearly 3 miles before the truck could go no farther. A fallen tree blocked the path completely. Hank shut off the engine and listened. The forest was silent except for the wind moving through the branches overhead. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph again. The symbol on the sign matched perfectly. His eyes drifted toward the distant shape, barely visible through the snowfall. Something large stood on the hillside ahead. Well, partner, he said as he climbed out, looks like we finished this part on foot. Blue jumped down and immediately started forward. Snow reached nearly 8 inches deep in some places. The climb was slow, but Blue never hesitated. Every few minutes, he stopped and looked back, making sure Hank was following. After almost half an hour, the trees suddenly opened. Hank froze. Sitting alone on the mountainside stood a massive stone house. The structure looked older than anything he had ever seen in the region. Thick gray walls rose from the rocky ground. Dark windows stared out across the valley. Snow covered the roof, yet the building remained solid and untouched by time. You have got to be kidding me, Hank whispered. Blue trotted toward the front entrance as if he had been there before. Hank slowly approached. Above the doorway was the same carved symbol from the photograph. His pulse quickened. Grandpa, what were you involved in? The heavy wooden door was slightly open. Wind pushed it back and forth with a low creaking sound. Blue slipped inside first. Hank followed cautiously. The interior was surprisingly clean. Dust covered the furniture, but the structure itself felt sturdy. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room. Shelves lined the walls. An old lantern still hung near the mantel. Hank set down the wooden box and looked around in disbelief. Someone built this to last 100 years. Blue was not interested in the furniture. He moved through the room sniffing carefully before stopping beside a narrow table near the far wall. His nose pressed against a leather-bound journal. Hank picked it up. The cover was cracked with age. Slowly he opened the first page. His breath caught immediately. Written in familiar handwriting were 3 words. Property of Samuel Lawson, his grandfather. Hank turned another page and found a dated entry from nearly 50 years earlier. He began reading aloud. If anyone finds this journal, the truth is buried beneath the house. Trust the symbol. Trust the path below. Hank frowned. The path below? Blue suddenly sprang away from the table and ran toward the fireplace. His claws clicked against the stone floor. Then he stopped and barked sharply. Once, twice, 3 times. Hank walked over and placed his hand against the stone hearth. A faint hollow echo answered from somewhere underneath. Hank kept his hand against the stone hearth and listened carefully. The hollow sound was unmistakable. Something existed beneath the floor. Blue barked again and scratched at the base of the fireplace. All right, Hank said. You have my attention. He set the journal on a nearby chair and knelt beside the hearth. Years of repairing engines and farm equipment had taught him how to notice details others overlooked. Running his fingers across the stone, he discovered something unusual. One block near the center was smoother than the rest. Its edges showed signs of wear. That is no accident, he murmured. Blue immediately pushed his nose against the same stone. Hank pressed firmly. Nothing happened. He pushed again. Still nothing. The old veteran leaned back and looked toward the journal. Trust the symbol. Trust the path below. He repeated the words quietly. Then his eyes moved to the carving above the fireplace. The same symbol from the photograph had been etched into the stone mantle. A circle surrounding a mountain peak. Hank stood and examined it closely. What are you trying to tell me, Grandpa? Blue suddenly trotted to the table where the wooden box sat. He grabbed the old brass compass from inside and carried it back. Hank stared at the dog. You want me to use this? Blue dropped the compass at his feet and sat down. For a moment, Hank laughed. You are either the smartest dog in Montana, or I am losing my mind. He opened the compass. The needle spun briefly before settling. Something immediately seemed wrong. Instead of pointing north, it angled directly toward the fireplace. Hank frowned. He turned the compass in different directions. The needle continued, pointing toward the same spot. That should not happen. Curious now, he walked slowly around the room. The needle stayed fixed, always toward the hearth. Blue rose and returned to the smooth stone block. His tail wagged once. Hank walked back. You already knew that, did you not? He examined the floor more carefully. Near the base of the fireplace, he discovered a tiny metal slot hidden between 2 stones. Barely visible. He reached into his pocket and removed the old key ring from the wooden box. Several keys hung from it. Most were rusted beyond use. One remained surprisingly clean. Hank stared at it. No way. Blue whined softly. Hank inserted the key into the hidden slot. It fit perfectly. For a second, nothing happened. Then a deep, mechanical click echoed through the room. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Somewhere beneath them, gears groaned to life after decades of silence. Hank quickly stepped back. The center section of the hearth slowly shifted sideways. Stone scraped against stone. A narrow opening emerged behind the fireplace. Cold air rushed upward, carrying the scent of earth and age. Blue moved closer immediately. His ears stood tall. His body was rigid with anticipation. Hank grabbed the lantern from the wall and lit it, using an old box of matches he found nearby. The warm glow pushed back the darkness. Slowly, he raised the lantern toward the opening. Stone steps disappeared into the shadows below, more than he could count. Well, partner, Hank whispered as his heartbeat quickened. Looks like somebody spent a lot of effort hiding this place. Blue stared into the darkness. Then, from somewhere deep below the house, a faint metallic sound echoed upward, as though a distant door had just closed on its own. Hank held the lantern higher and stared down the stone staircase. The cold air rising from below felt different from the winter wind outside. It carried the scent of damp earth and something older, something untouched for decades. Blue stepped onto the first stair without hesitation. You are really determined to go down there, are you not? Hank said. The dog glanced back as if the answer were obvious. Hank chuckled nervously. All right, partner, one step at a time. The staircase seemed endless. Their footsteps echoed softly against the stone walls. After nearly 50 steps, the passage opened into a large underground chamber. Hank stopped and slowly turned in a circle. The room was far larger than he expected. Thick support columns rose from the floor. Wooden shelves lined the walls. Rusted lanterns hung from iron hooks. This is impossible, he whispered. Who builds something like this beneath a mountain? Blue moved ahead, sniffing carefully. The beam from Hank's lantern revealed old crates stacked neatly against one wall. Most were covered in dust. Several carried markings that had faded long ago. Hank brushed dirt from one crate and found a date burned into the wood, 1974. His eyes widened. These have been here for 50 years. Blue suddenly barked. Hank turned. The dog stood beside a long wooden desk, hidden beneath a canvas cover. Pulling the cloth away revealed maps, journals, and several framed documents. One photograph immediately caught his attention. Hank picked it up carefully. His grandfather stood beside the stone house, smiling. Next to him stood 3 other men. One face looked strangely familiar. Hank stared for several seconds before realization struck. No. He reached into his wallet and removed an old family photograph he had carried for years. The same man appeared in both pictures. It was Walter Lawson, Tyler's grandfather, and Hank's great-uncle. "What were you doing here?" he asked quietly. Blue rested beside the desk while Hank opened another journal. The handwriting matched his grandfather's. He flipped through several pages until one passage caught his eye. December 12, 1975. "We can trust no one outside the family. If the records are discovered, the land will be taken. Walter believes we should sell. I know he is wrong." Hank frowned. "Taken by who?" He continued reading, but several pages had been torn out. Entire sections were missing. Someone had deliberately removed them. The old veteran felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This was no treasure hunt. Someone had hidden information. Important information. Then Blue stiffened. His ears rose instantly. He stared toward the far end of the chamber. Hank followed his gaze. Beyond the crates stood a narrow stone corridor he had not noticed before. Total darkness filled the passage. Blue let out a low growl. Not fear. Warning. Hank slowly lifted the lantern. Something metallic reflected the light deep inside the corridor. He took several cautious steps forward. The reflection grew brighter. When he finally reached the entrance, his breath caught. Embedded in the wall was a massive steel door, unlike anything else in the chamber. Thick hinges, heavy locking bars, no handle on the outside, only a small circular emblem in the center. The exact same symbol from the photograph, the sign, and the fireplace. Then Blue suddenly pawed at the ground beside the door and uncovered a folded piece of paper, hidden beneath years of dust. Hank carefully unfolded the paper, while Blue remained beside him, watching the steel door. The sheet was brittle with age. Parts of the ink had faded, but enough remained to read. Hank lifted the lantern closer. The handwriting belonged to his grandfather. There was no doubt about it. "If you are reading this, then Blue is not the first loyal soul to find this place." Hank read quietly. He paused and smiled. "Looks like your kind has been helping this family for a long time, partner." Blue tilted his head. Hank continued reading. "The records hidden beyond this door prove ownership of land that was taken through deception. We protected the truth because powerful people wanted it erased." Hank lowered the paper. "Ownership of land?" He immediately thought of the missing journal pages. Suddenly, several pieces began fitting together. Someone had hidden documents. Someone had removed evidence. Someone had wanted the story buried forever. Blue stood and walked directly to the center of the steel door. His nose touched the circular emblem. Then he looked back at Hank. "You think the answer is right there?" Hank stepped closer. The emblem was made of brass, and shaped like a mountain surrounded by a ring. It matched every symbol they had encountered. He examined it carefully. Small grooves formed a pattern around the edges. "This is not decoration," he said. "This is a mechanism." He reached into his pocket and removed the old compass, the strange compass that refused to point north. Slowly, he held it near the emblem. Immediately, the needle began spinning, then it locked into place. A sharp metallic click echoed through the chamber. Hank froze. "Well, that seems promising." Blue backed away as a low rumble vibrated through the walls. Dust drifted from the ceiling. The emblem rotated several inches before stopping. Another click followed, then another. The heavy locking bars slowly retracted into the stone. Hank could hardly believe what he was seeing. Nobody opens a door like this unless they are protecting something important. The steel door moved inward several inches on its own. Cold air flowed from the darkness beyond. Hank raised the lantern and stepped through. What waited on the other side was not a vault filled with gold. It was something far more surprising. A massive underground archive stretched into the darkness. Metal shelves filled the chamber from floor to ceiling. Thousands of documents sat organized inside wooden boxes. Maps, ledgers, deeds, survey records, photographs. Entire sections were labeled with family names. Hank slowly turned in disbelief. My grandfather built a hidden library. Blue trotted ahead between the shelves. His nails clicked softly against the stone floor. Suddenly, he stopped at a particular cabinet and barked once. Hank walked over. Attached to the cabinet was a brass nameplate. His heart nearly stopped when he read it. Lawson Family Holdings. Beneath the title sat dozens of neatly arranged files. Trembling slightly, Hank pulled out the first folder. Inside was a property map covering thousands of acres across the valley. The signature at the bottom belonged to Samuel Lawson, his grandfather, but another signature appeared beside it. Walter Lawson. Hank stared at the second name. You were involved from the beginning. Then a folded modern document slipped from the folder and landed at his feet. Unlike everything else in the archive, this paper was recent. Very recent. It had been printed less than 2 years ago, and at the bottom was a signature Hank recognized immediately. Tyler Lawson. Hank stared at Tyler's signature for several long seconds. The underground chamber suddenly felt colder. Blue stepped closer and rested beside him as if sensing the shift in his mood. You knew about this, Hank whispered. All this time you knew. He lifted the document and examined it more carefully. It was a land transfer proposal dated 18 months earlier. Several parcels of property were highlighted in yellow. His name. Notes had been written in the margins. Most disturbing of all was a sentence near the bottom. Remaining historical claims must never be rediscovered. Hank read the line twice, then a third time. That is not an accident. Blue let out a low rumble. Hank opened another folder from the cabinet, then another. Each document revealed more of the same story. Decades earlier, the Lawson family had owned far more land than anyone realized. Thousands of acres, timber rights, mineral rights, water access. Records showed everything had been placed into protected holdings by Samuel Lawson and several trusted partners, but sometime later, pieces of the truth disappeared. Pages vanished. Deeds changed hands. Ownership records became incomplete. Someone had carefully buried the history. Hank sat down heavily on a wooden chair. My grandfather was trying to protect something. Blue remained alert. His gaze shifted toward the far side of the archive. Hank followed the dog's eyes. There, mounted on the wall, hung a large map covered in colored markings. He walked closer. The map showed the entire valley. Red circles highlighted several locations. The stone house was one of them. Another circle surrounded the family farm, where he had been living only days ago. His pulse quickened. No, he traced a line connecting the locations. Every marked property now belonged either to developers or families connected to recent land sales. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Someone had spent years acquiring pieces of land tied to the original Lawson holdings. Blue suddenly barked once. Sharp, urgent. Hank turned. The dog stood beside a narrow filing cabinet, hidden behind the map. One drawer remained locked. You found something again, did you? Hank examined the lock. It matched the brass key he had used upstairs. The key slid smoothly into place. The drawer opened. Inside sat a single leather folder. Unlike everything else, it looked untouched. A note rested on top. Hank unfolded it carefully. The handwriting belonged to Samuel Lawson. If this file is ever opened, it means the truth is finally close to being revealed. Trust no assumptions. The betrayal did not begin outside the family. It began within it. Hank felt a chill run through him. He opened the folder. Inside were photographs, letters, legal records, and one sealed envelope. Written across the front were 4 words, open only when necessary. Hank slowly broke the seal. A folded letter slid into his hands. As he opened it, something else slipped free and landed on the floor. A recent photograph. Not old, not faded. Recent, less than a year old. Hank picked it up and stared. The image showed Tyler standing beside 2 strangers in expensive business suits. Behind them stood the stone house. Someone else had already found this place. Hank stared at the photograph for what felt like an eternity. Snow, stone walls, and the same house stood behind Tyler and the 2 men in suits. This had not been an accident. Tyler had known about the property. He had known about the records. Most painful of all, he had known about Hank. You threw me out because you did not want me finding this place, Hank said quietly. Blue remained beside him, watching the shadows between the shelves. Hank unfolded the letter from his grandfather and continued reading. The words seemed written directly for this moment. If you're holding this letter, then someone has already tried to claim what does not belong to them. The records hidden here prove the original ownership of every acre listed In the archive. The truth is protected by documentation, not rumors. Hank turned the page. Attached was a complete chain of property records, stretching back decades. Every transfer, every amendment, every signature. Unlike the altered files above ground, these were complete. "This is enough," Hank whispered. "This proves everything." Blue suddenly barked toward the staircase leading back to the upper chamber. Hank froze. A faint sound drifted through the archive. Footsteps. Very distant but unmistakable. He extinguished the lantern briefly and listened. The sound came again. Someone was moving inside the house above. Blue stood rigid. "Easy, partner." Hank relit the lantern and quickly gathered the most important documents into a canvas satchel he found nearby. The original deeds, the letters, the maps, the evidence. Years of military experience had taught him something simple. When the truth finally appears, people who benefit from lies often become nervous. The footsteps stopped. Silence returned. Several tense moments passed. Then a familiar voice echoed faintly from somewhere above. "Hank, Tyler." Hank closed his eyes. "Of course." The voice came again. "Hank, if you are here, we need to talk." Blue let out a low growl. Hank placed a calming hand on the dog's shoulder. "Not yet," he continued, reading the final pages of Samuel Lawson's letter. Near the end, one paragraph stood apart from the rest. "If the records are ever recovered, deliver them to the County Historical Board and the State Land Commission. The original holdings will be restored according to the trust agreement filed on May 17, 1976. Hank's eyes widened. There was a trust, a legal trust, one that had never been dissolved. He searched through the satchel and finally found the document. Signed, witnessed, recorded, completely valid. A slow smile spread across his face for the first time in days. "You left me a way forward, Grandpa." Blue suddenly pulled away and ran toward the far corner of the archive. Hank followed. Hidden behind a shelf was a small steel lockbox he had not noticed before. Inside rested a flash drive, a recent notebook, and several printed emails. Hank opened the notebook and immediately recognized Tyler's handwriting. Detailed notes filled every page. Property valuations, development plans, purchase agreements. One sentence had been underlined twice. "Remove Hank Lawson before final acquisition phase." Hank stared silently at the words. The last piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Then Blue nudged another item from the lockbox. A folded document slid onto the floor. Across the top, in official county lettering, were two words that made Hank's heart race. "Emergency hearing." The next morning, the storm had passed. Sunlight spilled across the mountains for the first time since Hank arrived at the stone house. He sat at the long wooden table inside the archive, reviewing the final documents while Blue rested beside him. The emergency hearing notice explained everything. A county review board had already begun investigating unusual property transfers throughout the valley. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. Someone had anticipated trouble. Someone had expected the truth to surface eventually. Hank carefully packed the evidence into the satchel: original deeds, trust agreements, survey maps, financial records, Tyler's notebook. Every piece fit together now. When he finally climbed the stone staircase and entered the house above, Tyler was waiting in the main room. His face looked pale, tired, older somehow. Blue immediately moved to Hank's side. Tyler glanced at the dog and sighed. "I should have known he would find you." Hank set the satchel on the table. "You knew about this place." Tyler lowered his eyes. "Yes, you knew about the records." "Yes." Silence filled the room. Finally, Hank asked the question that mattered most. "Why?" Tyler stared out the window toward the mountains. "Because I was told the land was worth millions. Developers wanted everything. The farm, the timber rights, the water access. They said the old records were gone forever." Hank shook his head slowly. "So you threw me out." Tyler swallowed hard. "I thought if you stayed away, none of this would come back." Blue let out a low huff. Tyler managed a sad smile. "That dog ruined a lot of plans." For the first time, Hank saw genuine regret in his nephew's eyes. Not fear, regret. A week later, the county courthouse was packed. Historians, surveyors, attorneys, and local residents filled every seat. Hank sat quietly beside Blue while officials reviewed the evidence. Hour after hour, the documents spoke for themselves. Original ownership records, the trust agreement, the altered transfers, the missing pages. By late afternoon, the decision was unanimous. The Lawson Trust remained legally valid. Several property transfers were overturned. Historical holdings were restored according to the original agreement. When the hearing ended, reporters rushed toward Hank. He simply smiled and pointed toward Blue. "You should be talking to him," he said. "He found everything." News spread quickly through the valley. People who once ignored Hank now stopped to shake his hand. Historians called the discovery one of the most important local findings in decades. The stone house was officially recognized as a protected historical site. More importantly, it belonged to the Lawson Trust once again. Several months later, spring arrived in the mountains. Wildflowers covered the hillsides surrounding the old stone house. The building had been restored carefully, preserving every detail. One quiet evening, Hank sat on the porch, overlooking the valley. A warm breeze moved through the pines. Blue lay beside him, older now but still alert. Hank reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears. "You know, partner, I thought I lost everything that night." Blue lifted his head. Hank smiled toward the setting sun. "Turns out I was only being led somewhere better." In the distance, golden light stretched across the valley that had once been hidden behind lies. The land was finally where it belonged. The truth had been restored. And for the first time in many years, Hank Lawson was home. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with friends who might enjoy it too. We would love to know where you are watching from. Tell us your city and country in the comments. More heartfelt and unforgettable hero dog stories are already waiting for you. See you in the next one.